Because one particular plucky Pugum has pestered me for long enough, it's about time I buckled down and talked about this one. There's a lot of weird trivia about this game, and I feel in some ways this is one of those Nintendo franchises that's sorely underloved. I mentioned it being as much when I talked about Custom Robo, so now seems a good chance to hash it out. Join me for a closer look at the oddity that is StarTropics. Greetings everyone, this is the hipster Snek, and today we're going to look at the 1990 NES title, StarTropics. In an odd twist of fate, this game was developed and published directly by Nintendo themselves, and yet never received a Japanese release, at least not as far as its page on Wikipedia indicates at any rate. It did, however, get a North American and PAL release. The game takes place on the fictional Sea Island as it's visited by young boy Mike Jones, who's come to visit his uncle, Dr. Stephen Jones. Upon reaching the small village of Coral Cola, Mike learns that his uncle had mysteriously vanished while exploring the ruins of the islands. The village chief then begs Mike's assistance and hands him what he calls a star in the most updated releases, which is, in fact, a yo-yo, and sends him into the ruins of the islands to find his estranged family member. And thus the story begins. To begin with, the graphics are great. I mean that in the context of what the NES was physically capable of producing. It was a late-era NES title that shared its release year with Final Fantasy III and Super Mario World, but it would be disingenuous to compare it to a Super Nintendo title of all things. It's kind of a strange marriage of the first Zelda and a little bit of Super Mario Bros. 3 in terms of its overall design, which is supposed to be a compliment, certainly. The game is broken up into overworld and dungeon exploration segments, with the former using simpler sprites and basic designs, and the latter having the camera a little bit closer to the action and having a bit more detail. It's a good trade-off for power and performance, and sound-wise the game is unambiguously great. I found myself bobbing along with the music as I played through the game, and the sound effects are just that satisfying arcade-style bip-boop kind of experience. Really, really good stuff. The game was designed by veterans from Nintendo, and it shows, all to its credit. Gameplay-wise, the game, as said, is broken up into its two major phases, its exploration and puzzle solving on the overworld map, and fighting monsters and dangerous exploration within the dungeon areas. On the overworld, you can move to towns and landmarks, interact with NPCs for hints as to the next plot point, and get to interact with a lot of NES-era game design decisions. There's this bit I encountered in the early game where there are hidden paths throughout these bits of the island. A lot of this slaps of either buy the player's guide mentality or alternatively, don't beat this in a weekend rental mindset. More on this later, that will become important. While the general throughline is generally obvious enough, there are some moments that are head-scratchers like this one. But not to the point that a little persistence doesn't go a long way, because the overworld is, broadly speaking, safe and poses no risk to the player, thus you can take all the time you need. If anything, it can pose opportunities by finding helpful items like this hidden heart power-up I stumbled upon. That's because the game's dangers lie in the dungeon segments, which serve as the levels as we progress. See, while the game maintains a kind of RPG motif, the basic gameplay loop is really a straightforward action-adventure game with a small number of RPG-ish elements. It's really more of a shooter game than an RPG. This is because the dungeons are the real meat and potatoes of this experience, adding in things like jumping and combat. Enter into one and you'll find yourself exploring sprawling hallways fraught with secrets to discover, and plenty of ways to randomly penalize the player's curiosity. Mike moves on a grid-like pattern, so his steps and jumps alike are pre-measured for the sake of the dungeon's construction. Likewise, enemies found within the dungeon typically follow very simple patterns that are fairly easy to memorize within an encounter or two. These snakes that show up early in the game remain stationary until they have a straight line of sight with you, whereupon they'll leave their starting positions to have a go, whereupon they can be dodged, jumped over, if your timing is really good, or attacked. And these bats, which constantly move in a diagonal trajectory and bounce off any walls or obstacles they collide with, continuing this pattern indefinitely. A few hits with your yo-yo or the limited ammo special weapons found in each dungeon will see that you conquer each. Speaking of, the secondary weapons you find in each dungeon periodically are, indeed, limited. And you don't have the option of taking any of them with you out of the dungeon should you finish said dungeon with ammo remaining. In fact, dying just once loses all of them anyway, so feel free to use them. Easy come, easy go. Speaking of jumping, it's a big mechanic in this game, as the dungeons are littered with these platforms you need to jump onto and off of again, sometimes just to hop across dangerous terrain, and other times in order to solve puzzles. chiefly consisting of finding invisible switches in order to open pathways. The neat thing here is that not all of these are obvious, and just because you find a method to proceed doesn't mean there aren't other paths to consider or secrets to find in the same room. I actually like this jumping mechanic, even if it's a little sluggish at points, because it feels like the platforming mechanics are very fine-tuned. The game has lots of ways of keeping it fresh, combining combat and platforming in the same area, or rooms that'll go dark over a few moments within, using enemies as context clues in order to solve a jumping puzzle. Really well done. Well, when it's done right. Because in other places you can easily be placed into blind leaps of faith, and let's just say that not sticking the landing will never go well. Automatic loss of life if you slip up there. In fact, let's talk about lives, since you'll be painfully aware of them the entire time you're playing. You have limited lives which refill whenever you start a dungeon or continue during one. Well, this is an old school game. You might expect to find extra lives, right? Well, here's the kicker. The one extra life item I found was a roulette item. Using a little save state trickery to see how it worked, I found it had a chance of either giving 1 life or, very rarely, +2 lives, and in a few instances it took a life away from me. Holy crap, it's a random chance to just die without dying. That's sadistic. Speaking of dying, it'll happen a lot because you're not allowed to beat the game in a weekend's rental. Not that you could back in the day, but one bad jump and some old school slap-in-the-face level design is all it takes to wipe out your efforts no matter how many hearts you have. Like the secret area I found pretty early on. The game rewards my efforts in exploring each option, and I find this room with some items in it. Completing the pattern here lets me into a similar room with some additional items to be found. Allowing me to do this yet again, it just kills me instantly, completely defeating the purpose of collecting items in the first place. How was I supposed to know this is instant death? By the player's guide, I guess. As you might expect, dying with lives remaining sets you back to whatever the last checkpoint you passed by may have been, though the game doesn't really give you any indication of what those are. Anyway, dying without lives cues a small save sequence so you don't lose progress and throws you back to the front door of the dungeon you're presently on. Admittedly, this is less frustrating than many of its contemporaries, but as an aside, I despise lives as a mechanic in games. It's a representation of the arcade era, using money as extra attempts at a game, and more to the point, the punishment of running out of lives being redoing content you already passed is just asinine to me. I didn't die back there, I died way later in the dungeon, but I do it all over again and again and again because this game is not particularly merciful. While you do get additional heart containers for more health as you clear dungeons and explore the world, that's not really a means of growing any stronger. In fact, it's the illusion of growing stronger. What do I mean by that? In the very first dungeon, when I had 3 hearts to my name, enemies would do 1/2 a heart's worth of damage to me, and then 1 whole heart when I was fighting the boss. In a later dungeon, when I have 6 hearts, enemies do 1.5 hearts damage by default, and the boss does 2. Mathematically, there's no actual change in how much damage I'm taking. Your only option is to brute force memorize each dungeon as you die and it repeatedly in pure trial and error gameplay. This is the Red Queen's paradox of running as fast as you can just to stay precisely where you are. Why? So you don't beat the game in a weekend's rental. Speaking of that, you couldn't anyway. The game when it first launched had what we in the business call feelies, a physical item that came with the game that served as its copy protection, a map that at a certain plot moment in the game asks you to dip in water in order to obtain a particular password necessary for progress. Renting this game or getting it secondhand meant that you wouldn't have the code, so you were simply not allowed to progress. While virtual console copies of this game have patched this element out, it reeks of the gamer culture of the time, both in good and in bad ways, I'd say. In a way, I kinda like it. It's a meta mechanic that involves a player doing something outside the game to progress. It's novel, and it's fascinating. This is the very concept that modern alternate reality games, or ARGs, hinge upon. I find it undeniably charming. And on the other no hand, it prevents proper game archival and preservation, so I also despise it for ever having existed. Being a game archivist is a complicated tightrope to walk sometimes, I guess. That said, my other beef with the game's overall difficulty is that all the bosses in the game are precisely the same with only very minor modifications to each. They are invincible except when doing a particular attack animation, and your ability to damage them with just a regular yo-yo is a complete and utter crapshoot. You are almost 100% of the time expected to have some ammo saved up from those special weapons you found in the dungeon, and, while this is merely anecdotal, they don't seem to do significantly increased damage, just a means of doing damage in a different way. so the bosses all take forever to defeat and are almost always just vomiting projectiles whenever they're in their vulnerable state. The only thing that really meaningfully changes is the number of jumping platforms scattered across each and how much you need to mess around in each room to actually start dealing any damage. It makes what ought to be the climax moment of these dungeons feel like the least interesting parts of each, because you go in already knowing, oh, this is the part where I have to wait forever for them to become vulnerable, take a few pot shots, and then dodge curtain fire. Remember how I said Mike's movement is grid-based? Guess whose isn't? Literally everything else in the game, including the bullets. This means that, as far as Mike is concerned, a diagonally oriented bullet essentially exists in the same 3 or 4 squares at a time, and if Mike isn't any of them when it goes, he's taking that hit. This means that there are many moments where Mike's sprite absolutely does not overlap an enemy or projectile, but you'll suffer damage anyway, which cycles back into the start of my grousing. You'll be replaying easy bits of the dungeons to compensate for cheap shots and repetitive boss encounters a lot. So, is that it? Do I hate this game? No. Actually, quite the opposite if I'm being perfectly honest. I find this game incredibly compelling, and even though I have my gripes, and there were more than a small number of moments where I rolled my eyes and mumbled under my breath about competent game design sensibilities and their evolution, I found myself wanting to keep playing. The story is very obviously not taking itself terribly seriously in the first place, like an NPC who will ask Mike if he hails from Americola, or when you meet beauty pageant winners on each island, who then ask you who's prettier and will praise you for your good taste if you choose them. Yeah, there's also a lot of soda jokes. Or how the through line for one dungeon in particular is a mother dolphin asking you to help find her son, and the fact that the game has dialogue boxes just for her squeaking cries, followed by an inbuilt multiplexing service where it's translated into English just because. And the fact that, spoilers for a game that's 34 years old, it turns out the reason Mike's uncle went missing is because of alien invaders. It's insanity, and I love it. I found myself having a huge amount of fun with it, even while being fully aware of the game's flaws and its frustrating moments. I wanted to keep trying, and I wanted to learn this game's shenanigans and figure out how to get past each. Game feel can be a complex thing to put into words, but I just found myself totally into it. The dungeons were challenging, the overworld, the hidden past made me want to seek them out, see what was there to be found. The chance to reflect on something as dated as feelies as a game mechanic made the revisiting of this game and its pre-internet sensibilities a fascinating and somewhat nostalgic experience. The game is, in a word, fun. And that's what matters the most, despite whatever things I could begrudge the game for. And that's the final word on this now obscure and underappreciated Nintendo title. This has been the Hipster Snekola revisiting StarTropics after all this time. Did you own this game as a kid? Do you remember the map feely? Or was this your first exposure to this underloved adventure title? Leave a comment down below telling me so. And if you liked today's episode, hit that like button to tell me so. And if you want more like this, including Snek tech, reviews, top 10s, and the new home of the Tomodachi Bros podcast, you'll want to hit that subscribe button to never miss a one. Continue joining me here each week for more like this and much, much more. And I will see you there.